evening and welcome. Our first piece is Cumberland Cross by Carl Stroman. Stroman's first original work explores the rich American folk style in two sections. The first has broad, moving harmonies under a Shenandoah-like melody, and the second is a lively dance reminiscent of an Aaron Copland piece. Composer Carl Stroman's contribution to band, orchestra, jazz band, and vocal music makes him one of the most performed composers, arrangers, nationally and internationally. His music is heard regularly in concert settings, television, and film. We hope you enjoy our first piece tonight, The Sounds of Cumberland Cross. Just a Closer Walk with Thee. The author is anonymous and unknown. But this hymn has been recorded by artists such as Willie Nelson, Patsy Cline, Randy Travis, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, and the group Alabama as recent as 2015. It was adapted for band by Calvin Custer. We hope you enjoy Just a Closer Walk with Thee.
The next piece is The Invincible Eagle by John Philip Sousa. Sousa wrote this march for his band's performance at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. He considered naming it the Spirit of Niagara in recognition of the exposition, but decided not to localize it because he thought his new march might eventually rival the Stars and Stripes Forever. Soon after its premiere, Sousa described the conviction and the spirit which compelled him to compose this march, noting, "It is what I call one of my sunshine marches. Some of my heavy marches are intended to convey the impressions of the stir and strife of warfare. But the Invincible Eagle shows the military spirit and at its lightest and brightest, the parade spirit. With the bravery of the uniform, the sheen of silken stands, and the gleam of polished steel. Please enjoy this march, the Invincible Eagle." next, you're going to hear the Beach Boys on stage. The Beach Boys were America's first pop band to reach the 50-year milestone in 2011. For over 65 decades, they have recorded and performed the music that has become the world's famous soundtracks to summer. The band started in Hawthorne, California in 1961 and was originally comprised of the three teenage Wilson brothers, Brian, Carl, and Dennis, and their cousin Mike Love, and school friend Al Jardine. The Beach Boys signed with Capitol Records in July of 1962 and released their first album, Surfin' Safari, that same year. The album spent 37 weeks on the Billboard chart, launching the young group known for its shimmering vocal harmonies and relaxed California style into international stardom. The Wilson-Love collaborations resulted in many huge international chart hits, and under Brian Wilson's music leadership, the band's initial surf rock focus was soon broadened to include many other themes, helping make the Beach Boys America's preeminent band of the 1960s. The piece you are about to hear contains a few favorites, including I Get Around, In My Room, and Fun, Fun, Fun. The Beach Boys on stage, arranged by John Moss. Tango is an instrumental composition by Leroy Anderson. It was later turned into a popular song with lyrics by Mitchell Parrish. This instrumental version of Blue Tango, recorded by Anderson, reached #1 on the Billboard charts in 1952. Although this Anderson piece doesn't give music to everyday objects, such as in his pieces The Syncopated Clock or The Waltzing Cat, it is still an animated piece that lets the imaginative listener picture a couple tangoing across the dance floor. Enjoy Blue Tango. At this point in the concert, we would like to thank Channel 990, 991, and stgentv.com for filming our performances each week. Please give them a hand. And of course, you know, if it's too hot or if it's raining, we will be at the PAC room, the Performing Arts Room, up at St. Gen. Otherwise, we will be here. Our next piece is Mamma Mia. This is a 2008 jukebox musical romantic comedy film based on the 1999 musical of the same name, based on the songs of successful pop group ABBA, with additional music composed by ABBA member Benny Andersson.
an international co-production between Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Mamma Mia, with Meryl Streep playing the lead role of the single mother, Donna Sheridan, Pierce Bronson, Colin Firth, and Stella Skygard play the three possible fathers to her daughter, Sophia. The film received mixed reviews from critics and grossed $615 million on a $52 million budget, becoming the fifth highest grossing film of 2008. Please enjoy Mamma Mia.
Shoutin' Liza trombone, which was originally called Hallelujah trombone. Without a doubt, Henry Fillmore made George Frederick Handel proud. The use of the introduction of the Hallelujah chorus to this march is brilliant and without question one of the most interesting quotes in the history of the band literature. We hope you enjoy this piece, Shoutin' Liza trombone. Pennsylvania 65000 is the phone number of the Pennsylvania Hotel in New York City. Before area codes, the first two numbers were called the exchange code and were represented by a word whose first two letters were used as the numbers. Thus, Pennsylvania represented the PE exchange code. The number today, complete with the area code, is 212-736-5000. Bill Finnegan and Jerry Gray wrote the music for this song, with Carl Sigmund adding the lyrics. The Glenn Miller's band recording the same became a smash hit, reaching the top 5 of the pop chart. 65 years later, Pennsylvania 65000 is still a worldwide standard covered by artists from Brian Seltzer to Hepted and used in movies from The Glenn Miller Story to Oliver Stone's football flick, Any Given Sunday. If you call Pennsylvania 65000 today, you still get the main switchboard of that legendary hotel across the street from the Pennsylvania station. Enjoy Pennsylvania 65000. The best of Queen. The powerful music of rock band Queen remains as resilient and recognizable as ever. This exciting melody or flexible instrumentation includes the timeless hits, We Will Rock You, Another One Bites the Dust, and We Are the Champions. Enjoy this rockin' piece of music, the best of Queen. When it came to writing marches that sounded great with bands at all grade levels, Carl King had no peer. Dedicated to the heroes of the Alamo, this very playable march has that certain quality which made it one of King's favorites. With a full concert band instrumentation, along with subtle changes in the instrumental scoring and percussion lines, James Suringer arranges and enhances this in charming epic for you to enjoy the Alamo March. St. Louis Blues is a popular American song composed by W.C. Handy in the blues style. It remains a fundamental part of jazz musicians' repertoire. It was also one of the first blues songs to succeed as a pop song. It has been performed by numerous musicians of all style, from Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith to Count Basie, Glenn Miller, Guy Lombardo, and the Boston Pops Orchestra. It has been called the Jazz Man's Hamlet, published in September of 1914 by Handy's own company. It later gained such popularity that it inspired the dance step, the foxtrot. The version with Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong on cornet was inducted in the Germany and the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1993. The 1929 version of Louis Armstrong and his orchestra was inducted there in 2008. Handy arrived in St. Louis in the early part of the 20th century. The song was allegedly inspired by a chance meeting with a woman who walked the streets looking for her man. Please enjoy the St. Louis Blues.